Everything else is His creation. Allah is the only goal. And you have to keep that focus in mind if you're going to end up at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One of our biggest problems is that our hearts lose focus. Our hearts drown in the ocean of dunya the moment that they lose that focus on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So our hearts start to face other things. Our hearts start to face other things in the dunya. Our hearts start to face other things that we begin to strive for more than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Second, we need to know our purpose with regards to that goal. Allah is the goal, and our purpose, Allah says very clearly in the Quran. And you'll notice that this is a question which a lot of people ask. Whether you're Muslim or you're not Muslim, whether you're an atheist or you believe in a God, this is usually a question that people ask. And that is, what am I doing here? We know that we exist, we ended up here somehow. What am I doing here? What's my purpose? Where did I come from? Where am I going? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala answers this question in the Quran. And He says, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسِ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. Very, very clear. Allah says, we have not created jinn and human beings except to serve us, except to fulfill ubudiyyah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You notice here, there's a very special construction of this ayah. The ayah begins by negating, in fact. The ayah does not just say that our purpose is to worship Allah. Because if the ayah said our purpose is to worship Allah, one could argue that our purpose is to worship Allah and to make a lot of money. Or our purpose is to worship Allah and be very popular, and have a lot of status, and be very pretty or thin or fashionable, right? We could assign another purpose. But the ayah says, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسِ. We have not created jinn and ins. First negates any other purpose. إِلَّا, and then adds إِلَّا, the exception. Except to fulfill ubudiyyah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to serve Allah. This is our only singular purpose. And you will notice this similar construction in our shahada. Same concept, this concept of oneness. There's just one, tawheed. Oneness of worship, oneness of purpose, one God, one focus, one goal. Just one. There can't be more than one. So when you say, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, do you notice a similar construction here? You start out with la ilaha, which is actually completely negating any ilah. You say, I bear witness that there is no ilah. There is nothing worthy of my worship. There is no ilah. And then you say illallah. And again, this is to say that there isn't Allah as an ilah and something else. Is nothing, there is no other ilah, and then there is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, singular, tawheed. This defines our purpose, ubudiyyah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is extremely important. You cannot be successful in this life. You cannot be successful in crossing this ocean of dunya without drowning if you don't know what you're doing here. You have to be very clear of what you're doing here, because that is what puts everything else into perspective. Every other role that you have falls under this umbrella role of being a slave to your master. So when you're a wife, it falls under that umbrella. When you're a mother, it falls under that umbrella. When you are a career woman, it falls under that umbrella. Everything else, when you're a daughter, when you're a son, when you're a husband, any other role falls under that. Third, In order to be successful in crossing the ocean of dunya without drowning, you need to understand this ocean. You need to understand the dunya. You cannot be successful in tackling this, right? In overcoming it, in mastering it. You cannot master this matrix unless you understand it first. The first characteristic that you need to understand about this ocean called dunya is that it is temporary. The Prophet ﷺ, when describing this life and his journey in this life, he said that I am in this life like a stranger or a traveler. And this is, in one situation when he was being offered some comfortable thing to sleep on, he said, "Mali walid dunya, what do I have to do with this life?" He realized and he knew and he taught us that he and all of us are just traveling in this life. Think for a moment about when you travel. Right now I'm a traveler, literally, right? We're all travelers in this life, but I'm traveling here in Malaysia. Think about what happens when you're traveling. When you're traveling, there's a few characteristics, something that's different. When you go and you stay in a place, say you're staying in a hotel when you're traveling, and you know that you're only there for a few days, how attached do you become to your hotel room? How attached do you become to your bed, your desk, whatever they have in that room? How many of you, I don't know anyone, raise your hand if when you go to that hotel, you now start buying lots of furniture, you'd want to decorate the room, put up some pictures on the wall. I don't think anyone does that. Why? Why does no one do that?
Then Allah and His Messenger and striving in His way. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so then wait until Allah brings about His decision. And now when you hear this ayah, you wonder, any of these things haram? Is it haram to love our parents? Is it haram to love our children or our spouses? This ayah isn't talking about your boyfriend or your gambling or your alcohol. It's talking about all halal things. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here is warning us that if we love even the halal things in the wrong way, we will become destroyed. Even the halal things. If we love our halal money, as we should only love Allah, we will be destroyed by our money. If we love our halal spouse, our halal children, our halal parents, all of these things are halal for us, our halal business. If we love any of these things, as we should only love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we actually become destroyed by the very thing that we love. And so we have to learn, and this is something that many of us are not taught, but we have to learn that there is a right and a wrong way to love. And this is one of the most important lessons that I have and that many of us have had in our lives. That there is a right and wrong way to love our children. There is a right and wrong way to love our spouses. There is a right and wrong way to love our money, our status, our power, our careers, our business. And so this is about how to learn to love in the right way. I begin this book by talking about something quite personal, and that is a dream that I had when I was 17 years old. And in this dream, I see a little girl inside of a masjid, and she asks me a question. She asks me, why do people have to leave each other? I was only 17, I didn't know much about what would come later in my life. But I'm having this dream where this little girl's asking me this question. Why do people have to leave each other? I hadn't experienced this yet, but the question was very personal. And I realized that this question was very relevant to me because I was the type of person who was very highly sensitive, and I was the type of person from when I was a child I would get very attached, and not necessarily in a healthy way. So for example, if I was in a daycare and my parents had to leave me for a while, I was one of those kids who would start crying and not stop crying. Other children could calm down. My dad used to say that when you started crying, you wouldn't stop. And so I was very sensitive from the beginning. This was my nature. I was a very sensitive child. And I would get very attached. It was very hard for me when my parents would have to leave. It was very hard for me anytime there was, for example, a problem with one of my friends. I would take it very deep. It would hit me very hard, and I would have trouble coping. I would have trouble recovering. And I give this analogy that it's like if you take a vase and you put the vase at the edge of the table, that vase is likely to fall and break. And so what I was doing is that through my unhealthy types of attachments to my friends, to everything around me, to moments, to outcomes, I needed things to work out a certain way, or else I was devastated. And so what I was doing is I was setting myself up for disappointment over and over and over because I had these very unrealistic expectations. My expectations were that this life had to be perfect. My expectations were that people around me had to be perfect. My expectations were that my relationships had to be perfect. And if they weren't, I was heartbroken. I didn't know how to accept anything less than perfection. And so what I started to realize, and this happened later on in my life, is that we always learn about love of dunya as being an attachment to material things. We're always taught that love of dunya is an attachment to things like money, or jewelry, or cars, or big lavish houses. But what we're not often taught is that love of dunya, hubb dunya, this destructive disease of the heart, can also be unhealthy attachments to people. And that was the realization that changed my life. I never knew this before. And because I didn't know this, I was continuously getting hurt. I was continuously becoming heartbroken by everyone around me and situations around me. And it was because I was having expectations of this life as if this life was Jannah. And what I realized is that this life is never going to be perfect. And if you expect this life to be perfect, it's like trying to extract water from fire. Trying to put your hand in the fire and get water. You're only going to end up getting burned. And that's what I was doing with my expectations and my attachments. But what I had to realize was that a lot of it had to do with my unhealthy, false attachments to people around me. From the very beginning, the type of attachments that I had with the people in my family, all the way to my friends. And once I realized this, it changed the way I interacted with people, and it changed the way I interacted with this life. Now, I finished the chapter by answering the question in this dream.